Okay. All right. So thank you again for joining us. I'm Jeannie Jaworski, and I'm so excited to be here with an awesome panel. And I'm going to let them all introduce themselves in just a moment, but I wanted for the last time, at least for the foreseeable future, go over some of our housekeeping items. So everyone is in listen only mode right now, but the chat is open. So feel free at any time to add questions in the chat. You all are also able to ask anonymous questions if you prefer to not have your name associated with the question. There's two ways to do that. The first is to rename yourself. If you click on more on your name in the participant list, you can change it to something that will not reveal your identity. The second way is that you can send me a message directly privately. And while I will see your identity, I will not share that with the rest of the attendees when I ask the question. On your screen, there is a bit.ly link. That link will take you to a Google Drive that has a Google Doc for each of the 14 panels that we've done over the past 2 weeks. And each of those Google Docs have all of the contact information for our panelists and resources like their LinkedIn page, resumes, and additional things that they have offered to share with you. So I think that pretty much gets all of the housekeeping things out of the way. So we will go ahead and get started and learn about our fantastic panel. So we're going to start with Elisabeth. Elisabeth, will you start just by telling us your name, your current role, and then what your background in student affairs is?
Okay, my name is Elisabeth Burick, and I am a curriculum specialist at the Foreign Service Institute, which is a part of the U.S. Department of State. Prior to working there, I worked 9.5 years as a live-in or live-on residence life professional at 2 different institutions. And then I did a brief stint in the registrar's office at American University in DC. And then I rounded out my student affairs role with 3 years as a housing coordinator. So housing assignments.
Great, thank you so much. Amanda?
Yeah, hi y'all, I'm Amanda Carlton and I am a talent operations manager at Stitch Fix, which is located in San Francisco. I spent 12 years in higher education prior to transitioning first to learning and development and now talent operations. And mainly that time was spent in student activities, student organizations, student government, leadership programs, orientation, fraternity and sorority life. And I worked at UC Berkeley, Georgetown University was my latest institution, and I left there as the director of the Center for Student Engagement.
Thanks, Amanda. We'll go next to Shannon.
Hi everybody, my name is Shannon Dobrovolny. I am currently the training manager at Project Home in Philadelphia. Before that, I spent about 9 years in higher ed professionally, mostly in residence life, but I also had a bit with that, or in addition to that, in conduct, student activities, Title IX. I was an adjunct faculty member, and then I also did a lot of DEI and leadership programming.
Thanks, Shannon. Brittany?
Hey everyone, my name is Brittany and I am an instructional designer at Keypath Education, which generally is kind of like an online program management company or an OPM. So if this doesn't ring a bell, just think of companies like 2U, maybe you've heard of Pearson, Wiley, those types of companies. And prior to my role as an instructional designer, I was a graduate assistant in the Department of Teacher Education at a small private Midwestern university. I did that for 2 years and I was like, all right, I gotta go.
Awesome, thank you so much, Brittany. Mark.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So my name is Mark, and I work as a training specialist and a team lead at Advanced Care Alliance of New York in Manhattan. And I've had a bit of a meandering career path. I started out in private industry as a federal contractor in the DC area, and then I transitioned into student affairs in my mid-20s. So I started in Virginia Tech in leadership programs, career services, multicultural affairs. Then I transitioned to UC Berkeley. I saw that, Amanda. And I exited student affairs working in multicultural affairs at Muhlenberg College, which is located in the Lehigh Valley.
Wonderful. Well, once again, thank you all for being here. So we're going to start our first question. I want to know a little bit more about what you do in your current role, and specifically what transferable skills that you brought over from student affairs to be able to accomplish those responsibilities. So we will start with Amanda for this question.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm currently a talent operations manager, and my role is specifically to support both the recruiting and the learning and development teams at Stitch Fix. And really just to think about the employee journey from the second they are interested in a role and they click on it on our jobs page, all the way through when they exit Stitch Fix. And what are those important inflection points in their career journey where we can help them grow and develop, where we further keep them engaged and connected to their roles, as long as it's the best thing for them and for us at Stitch Fix. So as far as transferable skills go, I think one of the huge pieces that I brought from student affairs was really project management. I think about, planning big orientation sessions in my last role, and, parent and family engagement, all the things that happen at the beginning of the academic year, and how we work towards those in very small increments. And that's something that I'm doing just in very different ways, whether it's around processes, around engaging new technologies as part of our processes, or looking at the effectiveness of learning and development programs that we're starting to develop and we want to deploy to the entire company. I think the other piece that often in these conversations gets discounted a little bit is actually the advising or the coaching experience that I had as an advisor or in student affairs generally. And that's both from a lens of in learning and development, doing intake with business partners in terms of what they need and what's going on in their organization, and just knowing what are really good questions to ask to get to those root causes and help them see a way forward. But also just as a great colleague and the friends and the partnerships that we have in our office, being somebody who's able to be a listening ear and to help coach somebody around their own growth or around problems that they have. So I'll let my other colleagues share some more transferable skills.
That's great. Thanks, Amanda. We'll move to Shannon.
Sure. So in my current role, I'm relatively new. I've only been there about 4 months, but I was brought in to launch a new learning strategy. I don't know if they really knew what they wanted, and so they asked me what I thought, and I suggested it in my interview, and they said, "That sounds good. Can you just do that?" So within that strategy, so I oversee our training, our employee training for about 500, our full employee staff, which is about 500 people. For some context of my organization, we provide services to people who are homeless or who are kind of on the cusp of homelessness. The services include housing, some job training stuff, medical care, education, that kind of thing. So we're really a full service operation, which in a lot of ways mirrors residence life. And we're meeting a lot of needs. And we're also a 24-hour, 24/7 service. So I found a lot of similarities there. So with that, So I oversee some of these mandatory trainings. Some of our roles have very specific trainings that they need. Maybe it's from a funding source or just because they need to know how to do it. I also am procuring and launching an LMS. E-learning is very exciting and is something that I think the best places are doing. And so it's great for me to be at it from the very beginning at this organization. And then in between that, sort of those larger strategy things, I developed quite a bit of a lot of training sessions. I'm working out some curriculum to kind of expand what we're doing. And within that curriculum, a lot of DEI and leadership, which is like a mirror with higher ed. That's something that I've found that everybody really wants. So if you're able to do that, it's definitely a huge transferable skill. In addition to that, I think just being able to deliver trainings, being comfortable with presenting. I worked for, I think, 2.5 weeks before we all went remote. And so I was pretty comfortable in person. I've been doing RA trainings and stuff like that forever. But now being remote, I've had to kind of become the virtual training person that I wasn't quite ready for. But having some comfort just with those in-person trainings really, really is helpful, and being able to speak in public is a skill that I'm really, really glad that I had from before.
Great, thank you so much. Brittany.
So for my prior, so I'll say my current role right now, a lot of my job responsibilities, a lot of it kind of rests on consultation. And so what does that mean in the field of instructional design? That means, speaking with subject matter experts, whether that's a faculty member or some expert in a different type of technical field, whether that's cybersecurity, blockchain, machine learning. I reach out to these faculty, try to diagnose what the needs are that they have and what we want to address for the general population. And another thing that I tend to do with my current role is we're constructing online learning experiences. So when I receive a lot of different technical documents and PowerPoints and just different course content material, I'm trying to identify how to structure and map that material online so that it makes sense to students. And I will say from my prior role, some of the transferable skills, as someone mentioned, definitely project management, 100%. There are so many different granular tasks and subtasks that you need to do with multiple deadlines. So finding a way to target each deadline and keep moving the ball forward. And also something that's kind of another transferable skill was just curriculum development. Again, you're working from a lot of material that the faculty have, and they would present the material on ground, but especially now with this current pandemic that we're having, many faculty don't quite understand how to translate their on-ground material to the online course space so that it's structured well and that it makes sense to students. So that's something that my job kind of really entails. And I think also, just to kind of piggyback on some other items that people have mentioned, I'm kind of in a weird spot where I'm not necessarily corporate, but I'm also not strictly higher education. So I'm in a sweet, soft spot. So it's kind of a weird kind of medium right now where I'm at. But definitely, if you're interested in moving into a field with higher education instructional design, you definitely need to know about adult learning theory, project management, as well as just how to create curriculum and problem solve.
Awesome, Brittany. Thank you so much. Mark, what's your transferable skills?
Sure, that was awesome, and it's tough to go last for this one. So I want to give just a little bit of context for what my role is before I go into the transferable skill piece. So my organization, Advanced Care Alliance, it's a nonprofit managed care organization with over 1,300 employees, and we support, I will say, the majority of our workforce supports people, underrepresented folks, low-income people with intellectual or developmental disabilities living in either the 5 boroughs of New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. And so I'm working very closely with subject matter experts that are in sort of clinical social work spaces, clinical specialists, managed care, or medical professionals, so doctors, nurses, nurse pracs, etc. And my department's function is really to provide ongoing education, training, orientation, in-services, and increasingly e-learning, right? A lot of that is driven by the particular historic moment that we're in, but something else that I'm observing in terms of the change in my role is that we've become sort of a hub of both virtual communication with our employees and also culture shift, or caring of culture. And I think that sort of dovetails nicely about, in terms of some things I'd want to say about transferable skills. I got to give snaps to the comments on project management, facilitation. I want to lift up this idea of adult learning theory, because I think when you are in the higher education space and not a faculty member, you're often made to feel like you don't have a lot to contribute when it comes to learning theory or pedagogy. And my experience in sort of, I'm in a nonprofit, but we're very profit driven. So I'll say here, the corporate space is that we actually have a really good analysis of what people need to learn concepts. Some of that is related to what Amanda was mentioning about coaching and sort of mentorship. And another piece that I think is really important So student affairs professionals, at least in my experience, are very good at finding new ways of doing work that is quick and scalable, and that is hugely important in the work that we do, right? We do this to survive, because my experience was people say, well, you don't have a lot of resource, you don't have a lot of time, you don't have a lot of information, go make a very complex program that is good and make it run, right? That's incredibly difficult, and we learn behaviors and strategies to survive in that environment that are hugely helpful. I think in any industry, but especially in the space that we, I'll say our panel collectively lives in, where we're working with subject matter experts, we're working with millions of stakeholders. So I just have to give snaps to that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Mark. And the good news is you don't have to go last on that. We're going to have Elisabeth close us out on this question.
All right, so I work at the Foreign Service Institute, and it's a part of the U.S. Department of State. And whenever people ask me to describe like what it is, I essentially say it's diplomat college. So that's where the foreign service officers go before they go off to their post. And my particular section is, I'm in the School of Language Studies, but in distance language learning. So my role is we are revamping all of our online language courses. They were made like 10 to 15 years ago, and they look really dated, and there's lots of things about like the language and culture that are dated. So we are updating them on making them more mobile friendly and things like that. So I am part of a team of myself. So I'm a curriculum specialist, but I work with instructional designers as well, graphic designers, and like an audio tech person. And basically my role is the keeper of the curriculum. So we all collaborated together, and I say all, we had, we're piloting Spanish and French. So we had the subject matter experts who are language teachers as part of that. And we essentially just restructured what the entire course would look like, and figuring out the order of things and like what do they need to know first in terms of grammar, then what comes next. So I work collecting all the curriculum that exists, whether from our current distance courses as well as the in-class teachers and language sections. So I take all that and I analyze it, catalog it, and then I directly work with our subject matter experts who are actually creating the content. So I have meetings with them, I assign them tasks, I give feedback on what they're sending me. I've even done like some kind of ad hoc training about things, because like they don't really create curriculum. So I've had to teach them how to write a multiple choice question. I've had to brainstorm with them about what content would be best in like a scenario, like what will diplomats actually encounter. So we need to make their training authentic. So that's a lot of what I do. As far as transferable skills, I'll echo what people said about project management and keeping detailed task lists and deadlines and making sure people adhere to them. That's something that you do in student affairs, as well as residential. I worked on a residential curriculum for 2 years, helped build that and then managed it. And so that's helped with my curriculum design. And also I would say just like supervision, like even though I'm not directly a supervisor of the subject matter experts in language, I find myself using a lot of the same skills, like emailing them, answering questions, working with different personalities. Like I started, trying to work with them all the same way. And then I quickly realized just with like student staff, they have different needs, approaches, they're at different developmental levels, different understanding levels of the content. So yeah. Those are transferable skills, I would say.
Great, thank you all so much. Now I'm going to shift to the gaps that existed. So in your first year on the job, if and some of you might still be in that first year, but what did you realize were gaps in the knowledge and skill set that you have, and how have you gone about filling those? And then one thing we specifically had come in a private chat is, do you find that the skills that you've had and the experiences with 18 to 22-year-olds translate to working with adults? And so was that a gap that you had, or, did they take you seriously? Did they see you as being skilled in that area, or was that something that you've had to overcome? So for this one, we'll start with Shannon.
All right. I think, okay, so thinking about like 18 to 22-year-olds, I think it can be broadened a little bit more than that. And honestly, for me, I'm using a lot of the same skills that I used with that age group. Not exclusively. Our organization has a really wide range of employees, like really wide of employee backgrounds and skills and where people came from, because we do hire people with lived experience being homeless. And so that's been a challenge, I guess. That's been a learning gap that I've had students who have experienced that too. But I'm also working with a lot more people now who don't have that education, or who maybe didn't even finish high school. And that feels very different from students. As far as gaps, I think it's just about understanding that people are coming from different perspectives. And the way that I've filled that is I've been very upfront that I'm somebody who's going to ask a lot of questions. And I felt like I needed to preemptively say, I'm not asking this question to like criticize you or criticize this process or come in and say, I know how to do it better. I'm asking it to understand because I really don't get it. And so I've worked with my supervisor and my colleagues and people to just kind of create a culture where that's normal and expected. But I do think that having those conversations in advance was really good. That we expect that we all need to provide context since we're coming from those different backgrounds. I also think something that's been a challenge, I don't know if it's a skills gap, like a little bit of imposter syndrome, dealing with a new job amidst pandemic in a new field. It's kind of been a lot. And I took a lot of gambles. And yeah, I took a lot of gambles and I said, yeah, sure, this will work. I just know it will. And I was confident enough that people said, well, yeah, of course it will. And then they did what they needed to do to make it work on the back end too. And so just kind of having that confidence. And then now I'm kind of like riding that. I'm like, all right, these few things that I thought might work, I just threw a bunch of things out there and they're working. And so I just keep doing it. So the way that I overcome it was I accepted that I might fail. Not everything's going to work. These people don't necessarily think the same way that the college students think, but they might. So let's try it. And it seems to be working out pretty well.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shannon. And I actually love the idea of telling people up front, like, I'm a person who asks a lot of questions. This is going to help my learning process. And I think it kind of combats both the pushback you might receive from those questions, but then also it helps you address the imposter syndrome without having to kind of acknowledge that that's maybe what's going on a little bit. So
that's exactly it. I don't want them to know that I'm not sure if it's going to work, but
yeah, that's great. Thank you. Brittany, talk about your transition and any gaps you had.
Yeah, so definitely. So I will say first and foremost, one of the gaps that I definitely had was in HTML coding. Now, this might seem a little like crazy, like what's the relationship between coding and like instructional design? Like, don't instructional designers rely on tools like maybe you've heard of Storyline, or maybe you've heard of Captivate, or even Rise? These are all very popular programs that instructional designers typically use in the field. Not necessarily with OPMs, which again means online program management companies. A lot of the work that we do is actually in learning management systems. So you may have heard of things like Blackboard or Sakai, Moodle, Canvas. So because of that, I really needed to fill in that gap of my expertise in HTML coding. So what I did was I actually enrolled in like a coding boot camp. So I'm learning like HTML, JavaScript, CSS, so many different types of programming languages to help. But I will say this is somewhat more of a rare kind of experience, just because many companies may not necessarily require that you know how to code. But another challenge was just kind of at my first company where I started as an instructional designer, so many different times we felt like we were building a plane while we were flying in it. And it's like, okay, guys, we're about to crash. Like, come on. But what I mean by that is we're like launching new programs, and we were such a small team of less than maybe 25 employees in the learning design department. And yet we're competing with companies that have hundreds, if not thousands of staff. So it was a little kind of stressful at times, but that's where that project management aspect comes in. And we kind of also say in the field, ask a lot of dumb questions to get really smart answers. So that's what we would tend to do. And there's a question about like, how does that kind of translate to when you work with like younger students or more so younger adults? And I would say in my experience, actually in higher education, I work more so with faculty because I was that graduate assistant. And so I consulted with faculty. I helped them develop curriculum for different undergraduate programs. And I also helped to administer their learning management system. So that definitely helped to help me in my transition to instructional design.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Mark, what was your experience like?
Sure. Well, I think for me, the biggest hard skill gap that I had actually related to my comfort in parsing through and manipulating large amounts of data, which was a surprise for me. So Brittany mentioned like, oh, surprise, I have to learn how to code to do functions, right? I would not have described myself as like an Excel or an SPSS wizard before I started my role. And then suddenly my supervisor is saying, hey, we need to parse through 20,000 pieces of data and visualize it in a way that is attractive and understandable to people that do not understand data at all, right? And so that was not a particularly frightening gap for me. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I consumed a lot of information. I am blessed to have a really, really developmentally minded team and of colleagues and supervisors that are just like, yeah, you have a gap, let's train. We're educators, right? We will teach you how to do that. I think something that is more macro level was so when I was working in student affairs, no one ever discouraged me from taking on like too much ever. So I would take ownership over practically every project that made its way past my desk. And I have not approached anything close to burnout, but I would find myself in situations in my current role where someone would say to me, Mark, I have a question about this initiative, or I'm not happy about this initiative. Please explain that. And they would ask me that question when I really didn't have any hands in that fire. And that was a very challenging place for me to be emotionally, because in the past, if anyone asked me a question, I knew the answer, right? And so I think for me, that also was a conversation with my supervisor. And there's a tool that I use. I think it's very popular in the business space. It's called a Lotus tool, and I'll share some of that information in chat when I finish. But essentially, it's a way of pinpointing behaviors and then creating plans around how you're going to address those behaviors. And that for me was hugely helpful in sort of getting a grasp of how I was showing up and how I was maybe hurting, I don't want to say hurting myself, but getting in my own way. And one other piece that I just want to mention, it was not a skill gap for me, but I think that if you're interested in this sort of work and you do not have a good handle on at least one e-learning solution, definitely check out like Articulate is one that I might offer up in particular because it has a fantastic free trial. Like you can easily teach yourself, I shouldn't say easily, you can certainly teach yourself that platform and be very attractive to an employer.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And Mark, I'd love if you could share more about that Lotus tool in the chat, because that's one that's new to me as well. Okay, let's go to Elisabeth next.
Okay, as far as gaps, as far as performing the job itself, it wasn't really difficult. A lot of the gaps were I really knew nothing about the foreign service or language learning whenever I took the job. So a lot of it was learning about like the acronyms, about the different diplomatic areas that foreign service officers could work in. So just learning all of that background. And then one thing that they do there, they are revamping all of the language curriculum online and in person. And so if you're on a curriculum team that's doing this, they automatically put you through this 6-week design thinking course. So that's what I did for like the first 6 weeks that I was there, was this like incredible design thinking course about language. So we learned how people learn languages best. We did a lot of like prototyping of lessons. We went all around the area learning about how people learn and expertise and things like that. So they did a really good job of equipping me as a curriculum creator, organizer, as far as teaching language. So they really did a good job filling in the gaps there. And I did a lot of research on my own because I was finishing up an instructional design degree at that time. So I was using some of that research to make some of my projects for my course. So yeah, like the job itself, like segueing it into it as far as logistically doing everything was not difficult. It was more just trying to accumulate the knowledge.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And I want to ask you specifically, because I think that in some ways you might be working with especially not 18 to 22-year-olds.
Yeah.
So did you have any issues with them taking you serious, knowing that your background was with college students?
Not at all. Like there was no, everyone that I've worked with, I work primarily with language teachers, and they've been nothing but, you know, kind and courteous and on the ball. And so I've never felt that any of them thought that I was like not capable or anything. So
great. I'm glad to hear that. All right. Let's see. I think no, I'm sorry. Yeah. Amanda, you're going to close us out on this one, right?
Yep, absolutely. I definitely want to echo what Shannon said about some of the imposter syndrome pieces. Is just like, are you sure I'm the right person for this job? Like, why did you hire me? But definitely, I think what helped with that was getting to know the business. I think what contributed to that imposter syndrome was a little bit of what Elisabeth was just saying in terms of not knowing the acronyms. And I think any new organization that you join, an institution, you know, a college or a university or anywhere else, has their own way of speaking, their own way of being. And I think sometimes that does a lot to not make our new employees feel like they belong or that they're welcome. And so it really was a hump to get over that and realize, like, why are people saying spicy all the time? Like, we're not talking about food. Oh, that's what we use to talk about our opinions that might be unpopular. Okay, great. But, you know, just really getting comfortable with the language that was being used around me, but then also getting really comfortable with the business itself. Like, I now know way more about retail merchandising than I ever would have thought I would have known. I know about merchandising math and the merch calendar. And it's just all things that I needed to learn in order to be successful in my job and in order to be able to connect with my business partners and be able to deliver to them what they needed. And I think an especially big part for me too, depending on kind of where you go, is also salaried population versus non-salaried or hourly and variable. And it was something that I didn't need to think about as much in the student affairs sphere in terms of like designing a training. It was more so like, how long can we keep people in their seats without mutiny, or like making it mandatory versus non-mandatory. But with where I'm at now in a corporate world, we're talking about money, we're talking about time. So if I'm designing a training or helping to execute around our warehouse associates, we're talking about taking them off the floor for an hour. And what does that do downline to our actual production and business, and how many fixes we're able to ship out the door that day. So just really getting into the nitty gritty and almost the economics of the business, or like, what is it at the end of the day that's that bigger picture that everything mapped towards, and really making sure that my work is mapping up to that as well. And then I'm taking it into account. On the question of the 18 to 22-year-old, something that I would not discount at all is actually how that work builds having very difficult, awkward conversations with people. Being in the student activities realm, you know, everything from why did you throw the couch out the window at this party to like, why are you hazing people, to why are you making inappropriate jokes, right? Like the conversations that nobody wants to have, but it's our job to have. And so I think, you know, now being a part of an organization that truly does value feedback, and part of the trainings that we develop and deliver are actually teaching people about how to give and receive feedback. That's been something that I was very thankful to have experience in, and I think was valued as part of the interview process when I was looking for roles, and especially at Stitch Fix.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so now I want to do a very student affairs thing. I want to know about your happies and your crappies, your rosebuds and your rose thorns. What are the highs and lows of your current roles? And specifically, if you could talk about salary and work-life balance and where on that spectrum of high and low each of those things fall in would also be great. So let's start with Brittany for this one.
Yep. So I would say like just a high for me is just the fact that in this field, you have to kind of you have to really enjoy knowledge, learning, and education. So you will have different subject matter experts come to you, whether they're from a cybersecurity background or whether they're from a nursing, marketing, data management background. You have to be able to kind of accept and embrace all of the information to transform it into the online course space. And I'm kind of I have the personality where I just love learning and love consuming information and more knowledge. So we're like the nerds of the workforce in some regard. So I kind of really like that. So that's a high. And I've kind of mentioned it in the group with those who have messaged me privately that the salary is pretty good. Like I can't even lie. You know, I see Mark over there nodding his head. It's really nice. And obviously compared to like more of that student affairs background, it's really good, you know. And honestly, it is kind of more so what you make of it. But having a decent pocketbook, it makes things a little bit better. But on the other hand, something that's a little somewhat stressful at times it can be sometimes the workload. So you you might be building and developing multiple courses at once. And there's just hundreds of like deadlines across the different courses to keep into consideration. And it can be time consuming. I would say where I used to work previously, course development could take up to 8 months. And that's a lot, but there are also so many different moving pieces. There's the graphic design aspect. You may want to go and record the faculty providing maybe a course overview welcome, different types of videos. So there's so many different moving pieces. So that can be a little nerving at times, but obviously, you know, this is a part of the job, and you really feel a sense of gratitude at the end when you see just what you've been able to develop alongside that faculty. So
Thank you so much for that, Brittany. Mark?
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to circle back really quickly on the 18 to 22-year-old question, because I realized that I had forgotten to mention that. And all I want to say with regard to that question is faculty and college students are both exceptionally difficult audiences to deliver training and education to. And so I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I only know how to instruct to children or 18 to 22-year-olds. You can definitely apply similar strategies in working with adults. At least I found that to be my experience. So I just wanted to make sure that that was mentioned explicitly in this context. As far as things I like, don't like, I'm totally using happy crappy in future. By the way, never heard that in student affairs ever. So obviously I love the functions of my job, right? I didn't mention this earlier, but when I was working in student affairs, there was a training or a curriculum design element to all of my work, and it was by far my favorite part of my job. And so knowing that I get to do that in a completely different context, healthcare, is just exciting to me. I will again say, yeah, we're compensated very, I would say fairly, or I will say I am compensated very fairly. And another piece that is probably especially unique to me, I am a non-exempt employee. I am paid overtime. I end my day when I end my day. I'm having conversations with my supervisor like, you're working too hard, Mark. Chill out, right? So just chew on that a little bit if you're in higher ed and you're basically working for peanuts. The other piece that I want to mention in terms of difficulties. So my organization has only existed in its current form for about 3 years. We refer to ourselves as a startup. And I think all of the good and the bad components come with that. So thankfully, we have a lot of infrastructure, a lot more infrastructure than I was used to in education, but we didn't always. And also, I'm in a highly regulated industry, meaning that requirements, expectations, they change on a dime. I had a project this morning that was completely transformed because my CEO was like, no, I don't want that, I want this. And mostly that excites me. It keeps me on my toes, but it's something to be mindful of, that when you're working with in a supportive sort of role and you have an end customer that wants your education to look the way that they want it to look, that you might have someone throw out your work and say, deadline is still the same, get it to me tomorrow. So that certainly can be a point of frustration.
Great, thank you for that. Although if you're getting overtime for that to get it to them tomorrow, that's a nice part of it, right?
That's true. That's very true. Thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you. And I just want to add, I don't know if Happies and Crappies is new to others. I actually got it from my mentor who was in her late 70s. So maybe it's generational, I don't know, but I just love it with all my heart as well. Okay, let's go to Elisabeth next.
Okay, so the best part of my job, actually, whenever they interviewed me and then offered the job and then I got the salary, I literally cried. It was like, and no lie, it was $20,000 higher than my highest paying job in student affairs. And so that was awesome. Another thing is that it's a 8-hour job. Like, you clock out, you're done. Like, I'm not expected to take anything home. I'm not expected to work on anything. I mean, sometimes if there's a project that I'm really into, like, I'll look at it and do some things, but it's like definitely not required. I'm not micromanaged at all. So it's been a very liberating job compared to my experiences in higher ed. And then some of the negatives are, it doesn't sound like so dumb. One of the biggest negatives is the commute. And DC traffic. Like, even though I'm not going into DC proper, like, it's just, that's the worst part of the job is the traffic. But like, job related wise, I mean, since I am working with a lot of people that aren't from the United States or aren't native English speakers, sometimes there's like a lost in translation thing with like culture or language, and they're not understanding what I'm trying to say. And sometimes that can get frustrating, or like I'm not understanding what they're asking. But the negatives are really minor compared to the positives.
Great, thank you so much, Elisabeth. Amanda.
Yeah, I'll just start on the salary point, echo far higher than any other role that I was making. And I think part of that also, though, is Stitch Fix as well. So our compensation philosophy is to pay for the role, not for the person. And a lot of that is rooted in not inheriting wage gaps, especially for women or folks who identify as female in the workplace. And so it just is like a breath of fresh air that there's no negotiation because of it, and it's tied to the market, and we get a market adjustment every 6 months. And so if the market moves up, our role moves up. It has nothing to do with how the company is doing. It's not how people feel. It's not, just a cost of living adjustment or a merit increase. It's literally like the market has moved this way, and we need to bump up your salary. And if the market moves down, your salary stays the same. So that's just been a very different way for me to think about it than all of the other roles I was in, and questioning like, what's the merit increase going to be this year, if anything? And is there any cost of living adjustment? So that's really nice. And then part of my compensation package is also equity in the company. And so as a public company, I have stock units. And so that's just also a nice bonus and a different way of incentivizing how we work and are productive and lend towards the larger mission. On the downside though, of like the salary and the benefits piece was actually retirement. So I was coming from Georgetown, which had a very nice retirement match, and felt very lucky about that, to a company that, as a fairly younger company, we had to be vested for a year, had to work there for a year before even contributing to the 401k. So basically a whole year pause with no contributions to a 401k at all. So that was a little bit of a downer. And even though I've been at the company 2.5 years, there's also no match. And so that's still, I think, one of the downsides across the company that people voice every time we do surveys and we're looking at our benefits packages. So hopefully it'll change soon, but definitely something to call out. I think just also echoing, like, from a work-life balance perspective, I think all of my previous higher ed roles had some level of crisis response. Both at UC Berkeley and at Georgetown, when there was some type of protest going on. Usually I was one of the first people to the scene and help to manage that, or, you know, of course, mental health issues and students that are connected with us in that way. And if we're a mentor to them or an advisor, often we get pulled into that situation. And it was nice to feel helpful in that way for a period of time, but it also was very emotionally exhausting. And so it feels really good when sometimes there is a high stress level across my team or with some partners to be able to take a pause and say, hey guys, we sell cardigans. Like, it's gonna be okay. You know, and so just to have that moment of levity and realize that it is not actually a life or death situation for us. It's really about money, whether you like it or not. So that's something that I've really welcomed in the work-life balance issue, and really not having guilt for not being on my email overnight or not responding to things overnight, and just being like, that's not expected. It's okay. And that just feels really, really great. I think too, I feel fortunate to be at a company that encourages risk taking. We often talk about minimum viable products, or MVPs. And so what is it that you can ship out the door that gets the job done, but it doesn't have to be perfect? And so really this mentality of perfection shouldn't be the enemy of action, and that we want to actually move and continue forward and do good things. And I think in previous roles, whether self-imposed or by the institution or the organization itself, often striving for perfection or waiting for the perfect thing to happen would often get in the way of any action at all.
That's great. Thank you much for sharing that, Amanda. I appreciate it. Let's see, Shannon, what would you add to this question?
Yeah, I think what I'd add, same thing, retirement. I have to wait a year. It's kind of annoying, but my salary went up, so I'm just going to throw it in my savings account so it feels like it balanced out. Something I would add on the downsides, I took a drop in PTO. I have about half. I had a really nice PTO package in higher ed. I know a lot of places aren't like that, but I haven't found that I've needed to use the days because my mental health is so much better. Like, I was using my PTO because I was burned out, and I haven't used a day in 4 months, and I'm really feeling okay. So that feels really, really nice. As far as the favorite part, so kind of the way that I think about this, I feel really valued and trusted. I don't feel like if I were to quit, they'll just hire a new person. Like in higher ed, I think people are very aware that there are always tons of people looking for jobs, and people who are really talented. Like, it's very saturated. And I don't feel that way in this. I feel like we could always use more training instructors or ID people. I also feel like I get to see my ideas through without as much red tape and politicking. Something I faced in higher ed a lot was it felt like to work well with some colleagues, especially ones who I didn't work as closely with, I felt like they had to like me. Even if I was new, even if they didn't have anything to do with me, they had to like me to just respond like, hey, I need you to fix my computer, IT. And they're like, well, no, you don't come in and talk to me, so I'm not going to do that. I'm like, okay. I'm not facing that where I am. So it's really nice. I know I'm going to get a response when I email somebody, even if I haven't met them face to face yet. I also feel like I would add, for me, people, they take things way less personally. We can work on a project together, and that's me too. I think we can work on a project together, and if somebody says, hey, this doesn't work and here's why, nobody thinks that that's like a judgment call on who you are as a person, because I think the general feeling is that people have dissociated their value from their job. And you can feel valuable in your job, and that's great, that's fine. I feel that and I'm thankful for that, but it's not the only place that I'm getting value anymore. So if somebody says your project sucks, I'm like, well, all right, let me go back to the drawing board, let me try again. And so that's really, really nice. It's nobody feels like it's life or death, even though the services we're providing for people we work better by not assuming that our jobs are, that direct relation.
Oh, I love that last line you said, like, even though our services may be tied to, life and death and living, that, our jobs aren't, and I love it.
Yeah.
So good. Okay. So let's transition now. I see some conversations coming in the chat, and I want to actually move to this for probably the rest of our panel. Let's talk about the job search that you all went through. So I'm going to throw a bunch of questions out into the universe right now, and whatever speaks to you, that's what I'd like for you to comment on. Don't feel like you have to hit all of them, because I'm going to throw a lot out there. But things like, what did you do to search for jobs in this area? What did you change on your resume to make sure that it would be seen and get through the hiring process? What were the interviews like? How long did it take? Did you have to submit a portfolio? Did you have to, I know in the chat, there's been some talks about like different certifications and things like that. So anything related to this job search that you want to comment on, and Mark, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you. Those are all great questions, Jeannie. So I think one that I will start with is materials, resumes, and specifically what the interview sort of looked and felt like. So I think it's important to first share that I didn't really fundamentally change the language of my higher ed resume, but what I have always done with my search materials is, rather than focus on, listing, exhaustively what my duties are, I would only discuss high impact results of my work. So I would never write something like, I managed a training program. I would talk specifically about the scope of that training program, what that involved, and what the value of that deliverable was. And I have always gotten very good returns on those materials. Usually where I would falter in my higher ed search would be, I would get to the end of an exhaustive, 6-month interview process, and then be ignored for 3 months, and then be like, sorry, we had an internal candidate, we like someone more than you, whatever the refrain was. And I had actually been searching for a position in New York City in higher education for something like 6 months before I said, you know what, this is a toxic field and I don't really feel very favorably about it anyway, why am I killing myself? And made the transition into sort of learning and development in whatever sector, except for education. And let me just say, we eat our young in higher education, right? I think my interview process for the current role that I'm in took about a month and a half, and I spoke with 3 people, right? And not all at once. I had a phone interview, I had a Skype interview, and I had an in-person interview. And wow, I'm doing great. I get along with my colleagues. Turns out you don't need to meet with 30 people to make that determination, right? I gave no presentation. Someone asked about certification. I made it very clear that I had experience in instructional design, in using e-learning platforms, because I had been fortunate enough in my work history to have that experience, and that was more than sufficient. It was mentioned in all of those interviews. And so I don't want to paint everyone's job search with a single brush, but my job search was much gentler than anything I was ever used to in higher education by a very, very wide margin.
Great, thank you, and I'm glad to hear that. Elisabeth, what was your experience like?
Very similar to like what Mark was saying. I was working on housing assignments, and I was finishing up an ID degree, and I knew I either wanted to do instructional design or training or something like that. So I was already starting to tailor my resume I tried to have like a instructional design resume and then a training resume. So I just kind of looked at some job descriptions of things that interested me, and then tried to figure out what some of the buzzwords were. And then, change some of my wording. Like I was seeing earlier in the chat about, instead of saying student employees, say employees, like you supervised employees. Instead of saying like parents and students, I changed it to stakeholders. So just using different types of words like that to make it fit into the field. So I started doing that. And then the job that I have right now, a recruiter actually contacted me. And she said, whenever actually I was having conversations with her, she said the reason that she did was because of me getting the ID degree and working on that, and they needed someone with those kind of skill sets that maybe had to do a little bit of design and stuff, but maybe wasn't like the lead instructional designer. So that's what she said. She noticed about my LinkedIn profile. That's what she saw. And then I did a phone screening interview with her. Then like a day later, she had me do a phone screening interview with her supervisor. And then that was probably like on a Tuesday. They asked if I could come on campus on like Friday or Monday. And then that night I had a job offer. So from the time the whole process started to the time that I actually accepted an offer was less than 2 weeks. So it went really fast. And like Mark said, yeah, I talked to like 4 people in the whole process. So it was really smooth.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elisabeth. Amanda?
Yeah, I'll start because I know, Jeannie, you asked like, where did you search for these jobs? And LinkedIn, definitely, also Indeed, and making sure you're using different search terms. Like it's kind of like trying to trick Google, right? You're looking for L&D, but kind of like the title of this session, also put in training, also put in facilitator, also put in ID, curriculum, coach. So a lot of different terms, but LinkedIn and Indeed were 2 of them. And then I think almost similar to higher ed, like if you know of a city that you want to live in or a place that you want to live, or maybe companies that you have high affinity for, like you like their products, you like what they value, things like that, looking directly at their websites and actually just kind of keeping track. So an organization that I actually love is the Gallup organization, like the Gallup polls, but also StrengthsFinder. I'm a strengths educator. And they were a company that I wanted to work for forever. Roles didn't come up when I was searching, but it's still one of those places where I would continually go to. So I think that's just a good practice. As far as the resume went, like definitely the scrubbing of the language is super important. But the other step that I ended up taking after about a month of searching was shifting to a completely functional resume. What I had gotten feedback on from recruiters especially was that a lot of folks looked at my resume, saw university listed, and automatically assumed I was a faculty member. They weren't going any deeper. Just all of a sudden you're a professor, and it's really hard to get that out of their head. And so that bias was already coming in. So by shifting to a functional resume, what I first did were those functional buckets that aligned primarily with L&D roles, similar to what Mark was saying, really focusing in on the impactful pieces where you can list results, right? Like what was the result of the thing that you did? And so letting that shine through. And then I listed my education, and then I actually listed my roles. And so they're literally like deep on page 2. And that was really scary because I think that's kind of counter to what we talk about a lot in higher ed, especially in student affairs. But I definitely saw an uptick after that in callbacks and people wanting to chat with me more. I also think too, from the process perspective, so I'll talk about Stitch Fix. It was not what Mark and Elisabeth said. It was not super quick. My process took about 3 months end to end and actually had 11 different stages, but all of those were primarily one-on-one conversations. And so what I did appreciate about it was like, you know, in comparison, I probably talked to the same amount of people, maybe less at Stitch Fix than I would have, you know, with that day-long on-campus interview kind of situation. But I got to do it over time where I got to like observe, think more, think about different questions to get deeper and deeper, to get to know the team, the work, and the company, so that by the time I was on site, I did have to do a project presentation, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But by the time I was on site, I felt like I knew these people and we had a connection, and it wasn't just this fleeting, you know, you're going to ask me 2 questions in a 45-minute period with 4 other people in the room, and we don't really have like a deep chat. So I really appreciated that aspect. And then the project itself, it was really hard. Like, it was meant to be a look into what the day-to-day work would be. And so I evaluated quantitative and qualitative data related to the new hire orientation program that Stitch Fix delivers. And then basically I was a consultant. I had to lay out short-term, midterm, long-term goals, and then like, what other information would I like? Who else would I like to talk to go deeper? And now being on the other side of that, the purpose of it isn't to get a right answer. It's to see my process. It's to see how the candidate approaches the problem, and also to give them a taste of what the work would be like. And so I think it did a really good job of that, but something actually that we're actively working on is thinking about how to do that in ways that don't consume so much of the candidate's time. And so shifting more so to like a project intake where we have them meet with a general manager of one of our locations and talk about what do the people managers on site need there. And it's like a 45-minute convo. And then they have half an hour to kind of put their thoughts together, present it back, and then tell us, what do they think is important? What would they like to chase after? What other info would they like? So it really does do a better job in terms of getting to that ultimate outcome of just seeing process versus feeling like you're doing somebody's job for them.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amanda. Shannon.
So for my process, I think it looked a little bit more higher ed-ish, and that's maybe because I moved into nonprofit. I think there are still some places nonprofit can catch up to. I did a recruiting screening. I had already done that with some other companies, so I was familiar with that, but that was very different than any higher ed interview I've ever done. It's more just like, do you have the minimum qualifications? And like, any questions you ask of them really aren't that helpful, honestly, but it only took like 15 minutes. Then I had an interview with the hiring manager, she's my supervisor now, like I don't know, maybe an hour phone interview. And then I went in and did a panel interview with maybe 5 or 6 people, and that was an hour. And then like a month later, I went back and did a presentation. And in the meantime, I also did a caliper exam, which I have some conflicting feelings on. I don't know how I feel about it yet. Honestly, that was kind of weird, but it's something the organization does. And so I did my best on the caliper. And apparently it ended up being fine. But that still was less than like any interview I've done in higher ed, even though it still felt a little bit excessive to go back twice. One thing I did notice, they asked me to do for the presentation portion, it was still only an hour and the presentation was only supposed to be 10 minutes. I think I did like 15 minutes. And it was like stars are coming out of their eyes because I just filled that time with so much information that I just overwhelmed them, hoping that something would stick for everybody. And I think that strategy really, really worked. And then they just like grilled me, I guess, but not in a granular way that sometimes I've felt in higher ed. It was more like, hey, we see you've presented at 2 conferences. What was that about? Can you tell us more about that? It was much more, they didn't have a standard list of questions, which was nice. They actually looked at my resume and asked me questions about me, not about them. And so that's kind of a different way of interviewing that I really appreciated. And even since being here, I've been offered the chance to give feedback on the interview process and what I liked and what I didn't like. And then upon giving the feedback of the things I didn't like was said, well, your department's going to be revamping the recruitment process anyway, so keep that in mind over the next year or so. You're in charge of changing it. So I found a lot more kind of malleability. So it's really nice to feel like my experiences are valued and we might actually make changes based off of what's working and what's not.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So I think, Brittany, you're going to close out this question for us.
Yeah, so something I definitely want to just kind of really emphasize for those in the job search process is please, please, please do not let perfect get in the way of good. I think there's so many times when you may, transitioning to a new career or a new career path, you want your next job to kind of check in all of those boxes that you probably outlined for yourself. And ideally, it would be great if we could find that fantasy job that's out there. And I mean, hey, you could make that job if you want, become your own entrepreneur. But unfortunately, just at this moment, just remind yourself that you may not get great, but you can get good. And from good, you can continue to gain more expertise, gain more experience in that field, become more well-rounded, and really hone in on what your skill set is. So if there is this stellar company out there that you would like to transition to, you can use those skills that you've gained into that other type of career path. In my interview process, I'll say when I first started, like my master's it's in curriculum and instruction. So when I was looking for jobs, I was like, oh man, like what keywords could I use? So obviously I was using curriculum, so maybe a curriculum specialist, a curriculum developer, and sooner or later, I kind of arrived down the rabbit hole of instructional design. And quite frankly, at the time, I was like, what is this? I honestly really did not have too much information or background on that, like that job role. But as I began to read more and more about the information, I was like, that sounds like what I was doing when I was a graduate assistant, working with faculty, consulting with them, developing curriculum, working in these online course spaces, performing like needs analysis, needs assessment. So I kind of grew like accidentally, and I know there's a book about like the accidental instructional designer, and I feel like that's kind of me and where I landed. But the interview process, for my second like position in instructional design, for me, it was like less than a month. Had the phone call with one of the, like a leader within the Department of Instructional Services. It was about maybe a half-hour phone interview. Afterwards, they presented me with a practicum, or like a take-home assignment that they wanted me to complete, some kind of project. So it had a prompt, and you have to consider ways of resolving this issue and create a course or create some kind of learning object. And when I had my in-person interview, that's when I presented it to like maybe 20 people. So that was very interesting. However, honestly, use that to your advantage. Do not get lazy at this point. Do not get lazy, and also learn people skills, learn soft skills. I think a lot of times they can see that, oh, you know what you're doing. You have the technical background and expertise, but do I like you? Are you someone that I can see at this company? So find ways to be likable and personable. And I know it kind of gets into that fuzzy field of like cultural fit. However, if you want the job and if you want the salary, then consider what you can do and how you can make yourself more likable. And also create a spreadsheet. Look at different types of jobs in certain areas, and look at what programs they want you to know, what skills they want you to have, technical skills, soft skills, etc., and use that to your advantage. Find those commonalities, find those buzzwords, and inject that in your cover letter and in your resume.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Brittany. I love the idea of focusing on the good, not the perfect. And I think that that's true as it relates to our materials when we apply too, not just the jobs, because what happens a lot in higher ed is there's a close date. And so we know as long as we get our materials in by that close date, we'll be part of the first round of consideration. That does not happen other places. And so you can see a job posted one day and 2 days later it's gone. But if you're trying to, especially since the advice is make every resume, exactly to the job and match, that's super important. but if you can I think Shannon was the one who said it, if you can have a master resume that already has done that work, and then you can pull from it and maybe change the summary or something like that. Otherwise, you're going to miss the job opportunity because it's going to close before you get your materials in, because you're trying to make them perfect. So I think that a ton of good conversation here in the panel as well as in the chat. Okay, so we've gotten through all of the questions, I believe, both that I had planned as well as from the chat. Thank you so much to our panelists who are keeping that chat so active. I just want to now give a chance for anyone to ask any additional questions they have in the chat. We'll keep going there, but panelists, anything else that you did not get a chance to share today that you think that everyone attending really needs to hear? And for this one, I won't, go in any order. Just if anyone has something, please feel free. You can unmute yourself, and we'll take that as you're ready. So Shannon, I see you unmuted first, so let's start with you.
I'm ready. I think something that I've started doing, kind of anybody in the expatriates group who reaches out to me for help, I try to provide some one-on-one counseling. I'm trying to give back because I got so much from that group. Keep listening to that group, ask your questions, it's okay. And I think something that I've found that I'm saying to a lot of people are to find a way to diversify your higher ed experience. I know for me, like, I have a pretty long list of different things I did, but that doesn't mean I had a whole bunch of different roles. I only had 3 or 4 in my time in higher ed, but I found ways to make it look different and to kind of spread out what you're doing. So I think for training, especially, I've given this recommendation to people who are not in res life. Just ask your residence department, hey, can I help with RA training? And then you've presented a training, right? Like, pick that leadership skill or that piece of diversity or whatever, and just do it. It's fine if it's to student employees, because as we've said, it's to employees. And so really think about, if you're not meeting those job descriptions now, find a way to do it, and think about what other departments you can collaborate with, because that is one benefit in higher ed. They'll take free work. So use that to your advantage, and jump on those opportunities that will specifically advance you. Don't jump on the opportunities that won't, I guess, unless you're doing it for like a close friend or to help somebody out. But really think about how can it get you further, what you're looking into.
Thanks, Shannon. Any other panelists want to get anything else in before we wrap up?
I'll hop in just because I want to highlight something that both Mark and I commented on, and Brittany kind of mentioned as well, I think. But being comfortable taking a step back in this search, like when you're leaving higher ed, and not feeling that everything has to be forward progressing, and kind of that humbleness of like, you don't know everything in this space. Like, you have been working in an industry and there's so many transferable skills, but you may need to take a step back to take a step forward. And what I hope gives people some comfort in that is that, at least from the corporate perspective, there's heavy attention paid on growth and development, and actually that, like, it's better for corporations to keep the people that work there and advance them. It saves us a lot of money. It contributes to our culture more deeply than it is to hire somebody from the outside. And so because of that, there are much better laid out promotion processes, growth tracks, things of that nature. And so just that comfort that you're taking a step back right now, but honestly, you're probably going to progress pretty easily and pretty quickly compared to what we've experienced, or what I've experienced, at least in higher education. And so just that was, I think, a piece for me, or a little bit of a mindset shift for me. When I started looking at jobs, I said I was a director when I left. So of course I'm looking at director level roles, and then realizing like, I don't know that verbiage translates. And also, like, I'm switching industry. What do I need to do to make that happen? So just wanted to amplify that statement.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Mark, go for it.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Amanda mentioned that. I'm not going to harp on that, but one thing that I will add to this conversation. So doing distance or virtual based engagement is 100% like going to be a regular part of this field from now on, no matter what happens with COVID. Like, organizations are asking themselves big questions like, do we even need Do we even need offices, right? And so I would just encourage people, and I know that this is going to be easier or harder for some folks depending on where they are organizationally, etc. But for things like pay close attention to the tools that you are using right now because of the pandemic and learn them very closely. So for example, we're using Zoom right now. If you can say, oh yeah, I know how to administer a Zoom call of 1,000 people or whatever, that's an extremely attractive skill set, right? And one that many people in my field didn't necessarily have a great handle of 6 months ago, 8 months ago. And so if there are opportunities for you to learn anything related to distance learning or even just like communication tools, what I think a lot about like WebEx Training Room, Zoom, Skype, I mean, the platforms are endless. If you can build a sophisticated understanding of them, there will be jobs explicitly doing that work. And so use the space that exists right now to kind of play around with it, learn it, even if you're not using it explicitly for your job function. Maybe you don't have a project you can speak to, be like, oh yeah, I taught myself how to be an administrator of this tool. That will get you noticed in interviews.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Brittany?
Yeah, and just to kind of to piggyback on that, just like find opportunities where you yourself can be an online student, especially in the field of instructional design. If you are working more so with higher education and different universities, if you are able to articulate just what it means to be an online student, that's a conversation that you can have during your job interviews, and you will see their eyes just like glow, because you are not only showing that you want to be a designer of those online course experiences, but you are also a student. So you see what challenges there are, you see what those gaps are, so you can actually tell them in detail, this is a situation that I had in an online course, and if I were the instructor, or if I were the one who designed it, this is how I would have approached it differently. They love those types of conversations. So that means something that you can do right now, like right after this call. You can go on udemy.com, you can go on Coursera, you can go on all of these massive open online course websites and find a course that may be related to training, that just saw a private message. Sorry, that may be related to training, that may be related to learning and design, or to curriculum. And you can start now and take those courses, and you could even try to like examine the curriculum, examine the structure of it, consider what would you do differently and how would you fine tune it. And thank you, Lauren. I saw your message. I kind of reacted there, but awesome to see that you are also a VIP Kit teacher.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany. Elisabeth, was there anything that you wanted to add before we close up?
I do. I echo a lot of what everyone said, but whenever I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do beyond higher ed, because I knew at one point I wanted to stop working in student affairs, I did a lot of informational interviews with anything that sounded interesting. If I came across someone that's like, I do this, I'm like, let's go get coffee. I'll buy you coffee. How did you do that? And then I would learn about like their path, and oftentimes it was really weird. I just kind of fell into it, and this is what happened. And so just information interview, anything that sounds interesting to you. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. And also when I was working at different universities and colleges, just approaching anyone that I thought had an interesting job. Like I approached the registrar one time at one of the schools I was working at, and just like, this is interesting to me. Why don't you tell me like what you do and how you did it? And even though I didn't end up working in like registration and as a registrar, I did form a really good relationship with her, and she was able to be a reference, and I was able to learn from her. So make connections anywhere you can, because you never know where it's going to lead you.
Awesome. That is fantastic advice for us to wrap up, because I know a lot of connections are being made right now, and there's a lot of space for this to all continue, even though we are now officially done with this this panel series. Again, all of our panelists have shared their contact information, so keep reaching out and building those connections. Mark, Brittany, Amanda, Elisabeth, Shannon, thank you all so much for being here. This has been an incredibly useful conversation, and the chat has also been fire. So I will make sure that when I post the video, I'll also put the chat in there so that all of the resources and information you've shared there can also be used in the future. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful Friday night and start to your weekend.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Have a great
everyone.
weekend, everyone.
everyone.
Bye.